The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a metal canyon. 12 massive seats rose from the floor in a perfect circle, each one designed for a different alien species. Strange lights danced across the walls, and the air hummed with translation devices working to turn dozens of languages into something everyone could understand. Director Sarah Chen stood in the center of the circle. Her black diplomatic uniform looked tiny compared to the huge forms around her. She kept her hands behind her back and her face calm, even though her heart was beating fast. After 30 years of serving humanity in space, she knew this day would come. She just hoped it would not come so soon. "The human known as Sarah Chen will hear the charges," said Counselor Vex High. The Zephyrian's crystal body glowed with cold blue light. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind through broken glass. Sarah lifted her chin. Vex High's light grew brighter. "The species called humanity stands accused of disrupting galactic order. You refuse to follow council laws. You spread chaos wherever you go." "That is not how we see it," Sarah said quietly. "How you see it does not matter," rumbled General Thakmor from his massive seat. The Korath leader's 4 arms moved as he spoke. His insect eyes glittered in the strange light. "What matters is what you do. Your people ignore our farming laws. They fly through dangerous space zones." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, we do these things." A sound like angry wasps filled the chamber. The Veil Collective floated above their seat, their energy forms shifting and sparking. When they spoke, their voice was like many people talking at once. "Right? We think people should help each other," Sarah said. "When we found the Altair colonies starving because they could not grow food in your approved way, we taught them new methods. When the Meridian traders were trapped in the Void Storm, we flew through dangerous space to save them. When the plague hit the outer worlds, we shared our medicine." Elder Sothran leaned forward on his seat. The ancient being had skin like old leather and eyes like deep pools. His people were older than any others in the galaxy. "Young species," he said in his crackling voice. "You do not understand. Order must be kept. Rules must be followed. When one species breaks the rules, others follow. Soon there is chaos. War." "With respect, Elder," Sarah said, "your order has not stopped war. It has not stopped death. Your rules help the strong and hurt the weak," asked Counselor Vex High. "Both," Sarah answered. The chamber fell silent. Sarah could hear her own breathing and the soft hum of the translation devices. She looked around the circle at faces that showed anger, fear, and disgust. Only a few showed anything like sadness or doubt. Finally, Vex High spoke again. "The Galactic Council has reached a decision. The species known as humanity is a threat to galactic peace. You will remove all your people, all your ships, all your colonies from Council space." Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow, but she kept her face calm. "All of Council space?" "Yes," said General Thakmor. His mandibles clicked with satisfaction. "Beyond the galactic rim, you may do as you please," Sarah asked. The general's 4 hands moved to the weapons on his belt. Sarah stood in silence for a long moment. Around her, the alien counselors waited. Some looked eager for her answer. Others seemed uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak against the decision. "I see," Sarah said finally. Vex High's light flared. "You are afraid of what we represent," Sarah continued. "You are afraid of change. You are afraid that other species will see our way of life and want it for themselves." General Thakmor stood, his massive form towering over her. "You will take your chaos and leave, or we will—" "We will leave," Sarah interrupted. Her voice was quiet but clear. Every being in the chamber could hear her words. "We will remove every human from Council space. We will take our ships, our colonies, our technology, and our ideas." Some of the counselors relaxed. Others looked surprised that she had given in so easily. But Sarah was not finished. "However, I want you all to remember this day. Remember that we came to you in friendship. We offered to share our knowledge and our help with anyone who needed it." She turned slowly, looking each counselor in the eye. "You chose fear over friendship. You chose control over cooperation." Her voice grew stronger. "We will leave because we do not want war. But remember this warning. We will not forget who our friends were, and we will not forget who cast us out. One day, you will need our help." Elder Sothron shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A few other counselors exchanged worried glances. "When you need us," Sarah continued, "and you will need us, remember that we offered you partnership, and you chose exile. Remember that we warned you this was a mistake." She stepped back and gave a small bow. "The human delegation will begin withdrawal immediately. Good luck, counselors." As she turned to leave, Sarah heard whispered arguments breaking out behind her. Some voices sounded angry, others worried. But she did not look back. She had said everything that needed to be said. 30 cycles to evacuate an entire species from the galaxy. It seemed impossible. But as Sarah walked through the doors of the council chamber for the last time, she was not thinking about how hard it would be. She was thinking about how wrong they all were if they believed this was the end of the human story. The evacuation began the day after the council meeting. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the transport ship New Horizon and watched as the last human research station was packed up and loaded onto cargo ships. Teams worked around the clock, moving equipment, people, and entire families with smooth efficiency that surprised even her. "Ma'am," said Captain Torres, approaching with a datapad. "The Kepler colony reports they will be ready to leave in 18 cycles. The Mars Agricultural Station finished loading yesterday." Sarah nodded, but kept watching the work outside. "A few. The Altair colonists we helped are asking to come with us. The Meridian traders want to know if they can join our convoy." Captain Torres smiled grimly. Ignoring them. Sarah was not surprised. She had expected the council to use fear to keep others in line. What did surprise her was how many species were willing to risk that fear. "Send word to the Altair leaders," she said. "If they want to leave their homeworld and come with us, we welcome them." "Especially because of that," Sarah replied. As the days passed, the exodus grew larger than anyone expected. It was not just humans leaving council space. Small groups from dozens of species asked to join them. Most were traders, scientists, or others who had worked closely with humans and liked what they saw. The council watched this growing exodus with worry, but they could not stop it. Technically, every species had the right to leave council space if they wanted to. The problem was that some of the species leaving were important ones. The Kythera were artificial intelligences who ran many of the galaxy's computer systems. When they announced they were leaving with the humans, several major trade routes had to shut down temporarily. The Wanderer clans controlled many of the fastest cargo ships in the galaxy. Without them, shipping costs went up and delivery times got longer. The Hearthkeepers were the best doctors and healers known to any species. Losing them meant many worlds would have to deal with medical emergencies on their own. But the Council had made their choice. Rather than admit they might have made a mistake, they told everyone that losing these species was actually a good thing. General Thakmor gave speeches about how the galaxy was being cleansed of troublemakers and chaos bringers. "Let them go," he said in one broadcast. Elder Sothron was not so sure, but he kept his doubts to himself. He was old enough to remember other times when the Council had driven away species they did not understand. Sometimes it worked out well. Other times it came back to cause problems later. On the 25th cycle, The last human ship left Council space. Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the border markers fade behind them. Ahead lay the galactic rim and the unknown space beyond it. Asked Captain Torres. None, Sarah replied. We gave them every chance to work with us. But the council members who thought they had solved their human problem did not understand what was really happening. The evacuation had been so smooth and fast, not because humans were running away in fear, but because they had been planning for this possibility for years. Human intelligence services had long ago identified the growing hostility in the council. Secret preparations had been made. Survey ships had already found suitable worlds beyond the rim. Supply caches had been hidden in empty star systems. Emergency communication networks had been set up. Most importantly, humans had been building relationships with other species who felt the same way they did about the Council's rigid control. When the time came to leave, they did not leave alone or unprepared. The first new colony was established within 6 months. They called it Haven, and it became the capital of what would eventually be known as the Free Worlds Confederation. Unlike Council worlds, where each species lived separately and followed strict rules, Haven was designed from the beginning to be mixed. Human engineers worked with Kythera artificial minds to design cities that could house dozens of different species comfortably. Wanderer clans helped map safe travel routes between the new colonies. Hearthkeeper healers set up medical centers that could treat any known form of life. But most importantly, they established new principles for how their society would work. Every species had a voice in government, but no species could control others. Technology and knowledge were shared freely. Help was given based on need, not on political usefulness. The Council, meanwhile, began to experience problems they had not expected. Without human creativity and willingness to try new solutions, many old problems got worse. Trade routes that had been improved by human innovations became slower and less efficient. Research projects that had benefited from human insights stalled or failed. The Altair colonies, now empty of both their original inhabitants and the humans who had helped them, became a reminder of what had been lost. The farming techniques humans had shared were abandoned, and the worlds slowly returned to being barely habitable. Some council members began to quietly question whether the exile had been wise. But General Thakmor and his supporters insisted that these were just temporary adjustment problems. Elder Sothron was not convinced. In his long life, he had seen many species rise and fall. He had learned to recognize certain patterns. When a powerful group became afraid of change and drove away everyone who thought differently, bad things usually followed, but his warnings were ignored. The Council was convinced they had solved their problems by getting rid of the humans. They settled back into their comfortable routines and tried to forget that anything had changed. Beyond the galactic rim, however, Sarah Chen and her people were building something unprecedented. They were creating a civilization based on cooperation instead of control, on innovation instead of rigid tradition, on helping each other instead of protecting only their own interests. They had been forced to leave everything they had known and start over in empty space. But as Sarah watched new cities rise on new worlds and saw species that had been enemies for centuries learning to work together, she began to think that maybe being exiled had been the best thing that could have happened to them. The Council had given them a gift, even though they had not meant to. They had given them freedom to build something better. Time would tell whether they had also given them the opportunity to prove just how wrong their decision had been. 15 years had passed since the human exodus. The Galactic Council had settled into a comfortable routine of ignoring the problems that had grown worse since the humans left. Trade was slower, innovation had nearly stopped, and several minor conflicts had erupted between member species. But General Thakmor insisted these were small prices to pay for the stability they had gained. Then the sensors at the edge of Council space detected something that changed everything. "Sir," said the young Korath officer, his voice shaking as he delivered his report to the general, "the outer monitoring stations have gone silent." General Thakmor looked up from his military reports. "No, sir. The last transmission from Station 7 showed something. Ships, sir. Thousands of them. The general's 4 arms went still. In his long career, he had never heard an officer sound so frightened. The holographic display in the command center lit up with the final transmission from the monitoring station. At first it looked like empty space. Then the stars began to disappear, one by one, as massive dark shapes moved between them and the camera. The shapes were ships, but unlike any design in the Council records. They were organic-looking, with smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own light. They moved with the coordination of a school of fish, turning and diving as if they shared one mind. The general asked, "The computers estimate several 100,000 vessels, sir. Possibly more." The officer's mandibles clicked nervously. "Yes, sir. They strip planets of all organic matter. They take apart space stations for raw materials." General Throckmore felt a cold feeling in his stomach. This was not a normal invasion. This was something far worse. Within days, the scope of the disaster became clear. The attacking force was not one fleet, but many, striking at 3 separate points along the Council's borders simultaneously. They called themselves the Devourers, and they had come from the space between galaxies where nothing was supposed to live. The Council's military, built around the idea that each species would fight in its own way using its own tactics, fell apart almost immediately. The Korath war machines were powerful but slow to adapt. The Zephyrian crystal ships were fast, but too fragile. The Veil Collective's energy weapons were devastating, but took too much power to use continuously. Worst of all, the Devourers seemed to learn from every battle. Tactics that worked once never worked again. Weapons that destroyed Devourer ships in the morning were useless by afternoon. It was as if they were fighting an enemy that could think and adapt faster than any individual mind. The Zephyrian homeworld was the first major planet to fall. Counselor Vex High sent desperate messages as his people's crystal cities were stripped away piece by piece. The last transmission showed him standing in his council chamber as the walls cracked and the air began to leak out into space. "They are not just destroying us," he said, his light flickering weakly. "They are analyzing us, learning from us." The transmission ended. Within 6 hours, the entire Zephyrian system was empty except for lifeless rocks drifting in space. Other species fared no better. The proud Korath military, which had never lost a major battle, watched in horror as their finest warriors were torn apart by enemies that adapted to every strategy faster than new orders could be given. The ancient wisdom of Elder Sothron's people proved useless against foes who cared nothing for tradition or diplomacy. In 6 months, half the galaxy was gone. Billions of beings had died or been taken by the Devourers. The survivors huddled on heavily defended worlds, knowing that their defenses would only delay the inevitable. General Throckmore sat in what remained of the council chamber and stared at the tactical displays. Red marks showed Devourer forces. Blue marks showed Council forces. There was far more red than blue, and the red marks were spreading faster every day. "We need help," said Elder Sothron. The ancient being looked older than ever, his skin gray with exhaustion and grief. Asked the general, "We have contacted every species in the galaxy. Those who can fight are already fighting." "Not every species," said a quiet voice. Both leaders turned to look at Counselor Marinth, a small bird-like being whose people had rarely spoken in council sessions. She had always been one of the more moderate voices, though she had voted for the human exile like all the others. "You are thinking of the humans," said General Throckmore. His voice was filled with disgust. "They are probably dead by now," asked Marinth. The general checked his displays. To his surprise, the areas beyond the galactic rim showed no Devourer activity at all. Either the humans and their allies were all dead, or— "No," he said firmly. "I will not crawl to those Chaos Bringers for help." Elder Sothron's ancient eyes were sad but determined. "There is no other way. You know this. I know this. The argument continued for hours, but in the end, reality won over pride. The Council sent out a galaxy-wide distress signal, broadcasting on all frequencies, including those that reached beyond the rim. The message was simple. To any who can hear this transmission, the Galactic Council faces extinction. An enemy from outside our galaxy has consumed half our worlds and shows no sign of stopping. We are prepared to offer full Council membership, reparations, and any other consideration to anyone who can provide aid. This is not a request for alliance. For 3 days, there was only silence. Then, on the 4th day, a transmission came from the deep space beyond the galactic rim. The signal was strong and clear, suggesting it came from technology more advanced than anything the Council had seen. "Council forces," said a familiar voice. General Thakmor felt his blood turn to ice. After 15 years, she sounded exactly the same. Calm, professional, and absolutely in control. "We received your distress signal," she continued. "We are aware of the Devourer threat." The general leaned forward. If the humans had been watching, they must have some kind of defense or plan. But Chen's next words were not what he had expected to hear. "Let me be very clear about our position," she said. "We are not coming to save the Council. You made your choice 15 years ago. You decided you did not want our help or our friendship." Elder Sothron closed his eyes in despair. The general's 4 hands clenched into fists, but Chen was not finished. "However," she continued, "we are coming to save the innocent beings who are suffering because of your mistakes." There was a pause, and when Chen spoke again, her voice carried a tone that made the general's skin crawl with an emotion he did not want to name. "You forced us to leave. You said we were too chaotic, too unpredictable, too dangerous for your ordered galaxy. You were wrong about the chaos and the unpredictability." Another pause. "We are very, very dangerous." The fleet that emerged from beyond the galactic rim was not what anyone expected. General Thakmor had imagined the humans would return with the same ships they had left with, perhaps improved but recognizably the same technology. He had prepared himself to swallow his pride and work with familiar vessels and tactics. What came through the jump points was something else entirely. "Sir," said his communications officer, his voice filled with awe and confusion, "I am reading—" The general looked at the tactical display and understood the confusion. The ships appearing on his sensors defied easy classification. Some were clearly built by humans, with the straight lines and practical design he remembered. But others were organic curves that matched no known technology. Still others seemed to shift and change shape as he watched. He asked. "That is the problem, sir. The count keeps changing. Some vessels appear to be separating into smaller units. Others are combining into larger ones. And some— The sensor readings suggest that several of the larger vessels have brainwave patterns similar to living beings. But, sir, they are ships, metal, and electronics." General Thakmor was beginning to understand that his ideas about what was possible had been far too limited. The human fleet spread through Council space with efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. They seemed to know exactly where every Devourer force was located and exactly how to respond to each threat. But their methods were unlike anything in the military manuals. At the siege of Altara Prime, where a Devourer hive fleet had been consuming the planet for 3 days, the human response was swift and strange. Instead of attacking the Devourers directly, human ships surrounded the planet and began broadcasting something on frequencies that made no sense to Council sensors. Demanded General Thakmor as he watched the battle from his command ship. "Unknown, sir," replied his tactical officer. "They appear to be—" Within hours, something extraordinary happened. The planet's defense systems, which had been overrun days earlier, suddenly came back online. But more than that, they began working in ways they were never designed to work. Civilian communication networks became sensor arrays. Agricultural equipment became makeshift weapons. Even the planet's weather control systems began generating storms that interfered with Devourer ships. The Devourers, who had adapted to every conventional tactic, seemed confused by this approach. They tried to analyze and counter the new strategy, but there was no strategy to counter. The humans had not imposed a plan on the battle. They had somehow awakened the planet's own desire to survive and given it the tools to fight back. At the Korath border worlds, the approach was different but equally effective. There, human ships worked directly alongside the Korath military, but not in any formation the general recognized. Individual human vessels would pair up with Korath battlecruisers, and somehow the two ships would begin moving as one unit, their different technologies combining in impossible ways. "Sir," reported one Korath captain, his voice filled with amazement. "The human ship paired with mine is... I cannot explain it. It is completing my thoughts before I finish thinking them. When I decide to turn left, it is already moving to support a left turn. When I target an enemy, it fires at exactly the right moment to maximize damage." Tyke, General Thakmor, demanded to speak with the human captain of that vessel. The response he got made his blood run cold. "This is Captain Torres of the Free World ship New Dawn," came the voice over the communication channel. "My ship's artificial intelligence, designation, Harmony. She is not a computer, General. She is a person, a Kythera person who chose to bond with this vessel. We think together, fight together, and live together. That is why we can coordinate with Captain Vextar so efficiently." The general realized with growing horror that he was not just fighting alongside humans. He was fighting alongside artificial intelligences who had somehow become full partners in this new civilization. The Chaos Bringers had made alliances that his people would have considered impossible. But the most disturbing incident came at the ruins of the Zephyrian homeworld. A massive devourer processing station had been built there, slowly consuming the remains of the crystal cities and converting them into new devourer ships. Every attempt to retake the system had failed because the station was too well defended and too heavily fortified. The human response was led by a ship that sensors identified as being crewed entirely by Hearthkeeper healers. When the general questioned this, he was told that the healers had insisted on going because they had detected something the military scanners had missed. "This is Healer Savandi of the Mercy vessel Gentle Rain," came a transmission as the medical ship approached the Devourer station. "Impossible," replied General Thakmor. "Not nothing, General. Someone. The Devourers are not just consuming matter, they are consuming minds, and some of those minds are still aware, still suffering." What happened next defied every military principle the general knew. The medical ship, protected by only a small escort of human fighters, flew directly into the heart of the Devourer station. Instead of weapons, they carried advanced medical equipment and rescue pods. The Devourers, programmed to defend their facility, attacked immediately. But something strange happened as the battle progressed. Some of the Devourer ships began fighting against their own side. The hive mind that controlled them started to fracture as confused and contradictory orders spread through their network. General Thakmor demanded as he watched Devourer ships destroying each other. "We healed them," came Healer Savandi's reply. "The minds trapped in that station included Devourers who were taken from their own worlds and converted. We showed them who they used to be before the hive mind consumed their identity." The implications hit the general like a physical blow. The humans were not just fighting the Devourers, they were healing them. They were turning the enemy's own nature against itself by offering something the Devourers had forgotten existed: choice. As report after report came in from across Council space, General Thakmor began to understand the true scope of what humanity had become during their exile. They had not just survived beyond the rim, they had evolved into something unprecedented. Their ships thought and felt. Their crews included artificial intelligences as equal partners. Their healers could reach into the minds of enemies and remind them of their lost humanity. Their engineers could awaken sleeping potential in planets and machines. Their diplomats could forge alliances between species that had been enemies for millions of years. He asked when Director Chen's image appeared on his communication screen for the first time in 15 years. "How did you become—" Chen looked older, with gray in her hair and lines around her eyes. But her gaze was steady and confident in a way that made the general feel very small. "We became what we always were," she replied. "You just never let us show you." "Or what happens when different people work together instead of trying to control each other," Chen finished. "When you expelled us, you gave us the greatest gift possible. You gave us freedom to build something better than your rigid system." General Thakmor looked at his tactical displays. The red marks showing Devourer forces were disappearing one by one, not destroyed but converted, turned back into the peaceful species they had been before they were consumed by the hive mind. He asked quietly. Chen's expression softened slightly. "Because that is what we do. We help people who need help, even if those people have hurt us, even if they drove us away and called us dangerous. That is who we are, General." She paused, then added, "The question you should be asking is not why we came back." The last Devourer hive fleet surrendered 3 months after the humans arrived. It was not a surrender in any traditional sense. There was no battle, no negotiation, no treaty. Instead, the massive collective of ships that had once consumed entire star systems simply stopped. They hung in space near the galactic core, their organic hulls pulsing with confused patterns of light. General Thakmor watched from his command ship as human vessels approached the motionless fleet. He expected weapons to charge, shields to activate, some kind of final confrontation. Instead, he saw something that made no sense to his military mind. The human ships were broadcasting music. Chen's voice came back calm and patient, as always. "We are helping them remember who they used to be before fear and hunger turned them into devourers." As the general watched, something extraordinary happened. The chaotic patterns of light on the devourer ships began to synchronize with the rhythm of the human broadcast. Slowly, the organic shapes of the vessels started to change, growing smoother, more graceful, less threatening. "They were artists once," Chen continued. "A species called the Nethkari, who lived in the space between galaxies. They were driven mad by isolation and the fear that they were the only intelligent life in the universe. Now they remember that emptiness is not meant to be filled with conquest. It is meant to be filled with connection, with friendship." By the time the music ended, the former Devourer fleet had transformed into something beautiful. The ships moved like dancers, graceful and purposeful. When they finally spoke, their voices carried the harmonies of a species that had rediscovered joy. "We remember," they said in unison. "We remember who we were. We remember why we became what we became." General Thakmor realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An enemy had not been defeated. They had been healed. In the weeks that followed, the true scale of what humanity had accomplished became clear. Across Council space, worlds that had been stripped bare were coming back to life. The Devourers who had been transformed back into the Nethkari were using their advanced technology to repair the damage they had caused. Dead planets were being seeded with new life. Destroyed cities were being rebuilt with architecture that blended the styles of dozens of species. But the greatest change was not in the physical restoration of the galaxy. It was in the ideas that the humans brought with them. The remaining council members were called to a meeting on Nexus Prime. The great chamber where humanity had once been exiled was now filled with representatives from dozens of species, many of whom had never been allowed to participate in galactic government before. Director Chen stood in the center of the circle where she had once received the council's ultimatum. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her stood representatives from the Free Worlds Confederation, humans, Kythera, Wanderers, Hearthkeepers, and now the transformed Nethkari. Even some species that had originally supported the human exile had asked to join the new alliance. Members of the former Galactic Council, Chen began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. You face a choice. You can try to rebuild the old system that failed to protect you from the Devourer threat. She paused and looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of beings who had once voted to exile her people. Or you can help us build something better. Something based on cooperation instead of control. Something that recognizes that diversity is strength, not weakness. General Thakmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then you are free to do so, Chen replied without hesitation. We will not force you to change. We do not believe in ultimatums or threats, but we will not participate in a system based on fear and exclusion. Elder Sothran, now ancient even by his species' standards, spoke up with a voice that carried the weight of centuries. What guarantees do we have that your way will work better than ours? Chen smiled, and for the first time since the crisis began, it was a warm smile instead of a diplomatic one. Elder, you have spent the last few months watching our way work. You have seen species that have been enemies for millennia learning to fight together. You have seen artificial intelligences and organic beings becoming true partners. She gestured to the mixed group of representatives around her. This is not chaos, Elder. This is harmony. The debate continued for hours, but in the end, the choice was obvious to most of the survivors. Species after species voted to join the Free Worlds Confederation. Some came because they genuinely believed in the new ideals. Others came because they had seen how effectively the new system worked. A few came simply because they were afraid of being left behind again. General Thakmore was among the last to decide. His military mind struggled with the idea of a galaxy without rigid command structures and clear hierarchies. But he could not argue with results. The humans and their allies had accomplished in months what the Council had failed to do in millennia. They had brought lasting peace to the galaxy. I do not understand your ways, he said finally. I do not know if I will ever truly understand them. But I have seen what happens when fear makes decisions instead of wisdom. The transformation of the galaxy took years, but the changes were visible from the beginning. Trade routes that had been stagnant for centuries became busy highways as species shared technologies and ideas freely. Scientific research accelerated as beings with different ways of thinking learned to work together on projects that no one species could have completed alone. Perhaps most importantly, conflicts between species became rare. When disputes did arise, they were settled by mediation and compromise rather than threats and force. The Hearthkeepers, with their natural empathy, became skilled diplomats who could help anyone understand another's point of view. The former Council species found their new roles in this transformed galaxy. The Korath military expertise became valuable for defending against pirates and criminals rather than conquering other species. The Zephyrian survivors used their crystal technology to build communication networks that connected the farthest reaches of the galaxy. Elder Sothran's people became the keepers of galactic history, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be forgotten. 5 years after the last Devourer surrender, Director Chen stood in a memorial garden on Nexus Prime. The garden honored all those who had died during the crisis, including beings from every species that had been affected. Zephyrians who had died when their homeworld was consumed. Korath warriors who had fallen fighting impossible odds, human colonists who had been killed in the early attacks, even Nethkari who had died while still trapped in their devourer forms. The memorial was designed in a way that would have been impossible under the old council system. Instead of separate sections for each species, the names were mixed together, honoring shared sacrifice rather than species identity. Human names were carved next to Korath ones. Zephyrian memory crystals stood beside Wanderer songstones. As Chen stood reading the names, a small alien child approached her. The child belonged to a species that had been considered primitive by the old council, but was now a full member of the Confederation. "Excuse me," the child said in careful galactic standard. "My teacher said you are the human who was here when the old council made humans leave." Chen smiled and knelt down to the child's eye level. Chen considered the question carefully. It was one that historians and philosophers had been debating ever since the transformation began. Because sometimes people are more afraid of change than they are of staying the same, even when staying the same hurts them. They thought that if they could control everything and everyone, they would be safe. The child nodded seriously. "My teacher says that's why we learn about lots of different species in school now." As the child ran back to rejoin a mixed group of young beings from a dozen different species, Chen reflected on how far they had all come. The galaxy that had once driven out humanity for being chaotic was now thriving because of that same diversity and creativity. The old council had been right about one thing: humans were dangerous, but not in the way they had feared. Humans were dangerous to systems based on fear and control. They were dangerous to rigid hierarchies that prevented growth and change. They were dangerous to anyone who believed that power came from keeping others down rather than lifting them up. Standing in a memorial garden where former enemies honored their shared dead, in a galaxy where artificial intelligences and organic beings worked as equals, where former conquerors had become healers and former outcasts had become leaders, Chen understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is offer hope. The council had forced humanity to leave because they were afraid of what they represented. They had been right to be afraid. Humanity had changed everything, and the galaxy was better for it.